Olivia Brown.
I'm Brandon Lyles.
And I'm Stacy Loveland, and we're excited to have you join us for Colonial Williamsburg's CW Kids Ask,
where we dive deep into history.
Together, we'll explore 18th century life and connect it to present-day experiences.
We'll look at everything from fashion to science
and economy to archaeology. We'll take a closer look at our past and present.
Join us each month on our live streams and submit your own questions.
Or watch past episodes and start your own conversations.
The past has something for everyone.
So come join us
as we discover the past.
How do we learn about women in colonial America?
Hello everyone, thank you all for joining us today for this episode of CW Kids Ask. This is our monthly live stream just for students, where we will explore 18th century life and learn about the people, events, and ideas that helped shape America. Each month we will bust some myths and misconceptions, explore primary sources, and answer questions that you all send to us in the chat. I'm Divya Brown, and today we're going to answer the question, how do we learn about women in colonial America? Joining me today we have Christy Hammond and Hope Wright. Let's get started by having you tell us a bit about yourselves.
Well, my name is Hope Wright. I am an actor-interpreter in the Museum Theater Department, and that simply means that I portray different historical figures, maybe about a dozen or so free and enslaved black women of the period, in different plays and shows, but also out on our streets where you can meet and interact and ask any questions that you may have.
And my name is Christy Hammond. I am an orientation sites and groups interpreter, so I could be anywhere answering questions as you're wandering through town. I could be giving tours of a building or to school and groups that come to see us.
Thank you both so much for joining us. Today we're going to have a chance to dive into all the different ways we can use primary sources to learn about women in the 18th century and how we use that knowledge to build a more complete picture of 18th century Virginia. To get us started, what is a primary source and how does it differ from a secondary source?
Well, a primary source is anything that is made or created in the time period in which you're studying. So for me, a lot of those primary sources that I use are things like inventories, taken after a person's death, or things like ads that are placed by enslaved people who are seeking to liberate. These are things written and created at the time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that's a great description. I guess you asked also about secondary sources, and we have to look at some bias too in those, mm-hmm. and seeing that individuals are going to have bias when they're writing them, even in the moment, yes. But also mm-hmm. if somebody else is, say, publishing or editing a diary or a journal, then that might have a little bit of an effect on what's being said, what's left in, what's taken out. And then those secondary sources are what people write or create after having looked at, hopefully, primary sources and somebody else's take on the events that happened who wasn't actually there when they were happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, both primary and secondary sources are very useful. I think primary sources are a little more interesting, mm-hmm. but you can get a lot more good analysis from a secondary source occasionally. But primary sources are very important for historians. Sometimes they can present difficulties. Can you tell us why we have to be careful when looking at primary sources? You did a little bit, but also what we have to keep in mind when studying history through these types of sources.
I guess for me is that there is a bias, and oftentimes when looking at women in the 18th century across the board, white and black, free and enslaved, it's usually through somebody else's lens, so we don't necessarily always get things from their point of view, from their mouth. And also for everything that is listed, there are a lot of things that aren't mentioned. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times you think, as a historian, if you find that one fact, that will put a nice neat bow on the question you wanted to answer. But usually when we find that additional fact that we've been looking for, now we have 20, 30, 50 more questions to answer.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, very perfectly put. I think for every question we answer, we end up coming away with more questions than we actually answer. Primary sources are one of the most valuable tools historians have when it comes to understanding the past, and they can help us reconstruct homes, clothing, and even daily life in the 18th century. Let's take a look at one of our historic sites to see that in action.
My name's Amanda Keller, and I'm the manager for Historic Interiors, and I also curate the household accessories collection at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Right now, we're standing in the laundry, which is in a nice long complex of outbuildings that were here at the Randolph property. The reason that we have furnished spaces in all of our exhibition sites is so that we can help bring these spaces to life. So when I'm starting to furnish a space, what I typically look at to see if we have any documents for that site. So we look back in the 18th century records. So we look at probate inventories, which usually included a list of belongings that would have been in every space of the house and their value. That helps me know exactly how each space was used, even if it's not denoted, if this was a laundry and then it lists the things, I could still figure out that that was a laundry space based on the objects that are listed on the document. We also look at wills. We look to see what people left to other people in their family. We also use things like the archaeological records. So I talk to archaeologists and then they pull out in drawers the things that they found in the ground at the site. And then we also look at things that people were buying. So we look at merchant records. We look at what was being imported into the city of Williamsburg. I love looking at account books and letters to see what they were ordering for their households. And even merchant records help us understand what were the enslaved buying in stores? What objects did they need for their families? What I find is the most difficult, you can't really furnish a space unless you know how to do the work that was done in the space. So we also look at things called prescriptive literature, which are manuals, essentially, that would have talked about how the work was done in the 18th century. We look at servant guides. Servant manuals are wonderful sources because they actually list what you would have needed to do the work at hand. So laundry, for example, lists exactly what kinds of materials you would need to do that work. And that often helps me figure out which objects are needed. And in this space, the laundry, we know that the Randolphs owned extremely fine linens for their bedsteads, fine linens for their clothing. And we know for sure that somebody was cleaning those things every day. Laundry and textiles is a huge thing. A huge amount of labor goes into those things, whether it was maintaining them, repairing them, sewing them themselves. So we know the enslaved, the 27 enslaved people that we talk about every day at the Randolph House were doing a lot of that labor. And so this space, the laundry that we're standing in right now, talks about that through the objects. Things like copper kettles. Copper kettles is where you would heat your water, right? You need hot water to do laundry. You need things like wooden tubs on washstands, right? So you could actually be doing your actual scrubbing in these spaces. And then buckets of water. You need lots of water to be able to do laundry. So a lot of those things are here. Scrub brushes that we have behind me on the table, irons for ironing out creases. And then of course, clotheslines so that you could actually dry your laundry by the fire where it would be nice and warm. So the one thing that is hard is probate inventories don't list everything. I wish they did, but they often omit things that are considered not valuable enough to be listed. Things like woodenware, like buckets, often don't ever appear on a probate. So if I simply followed that list, I would be not including the objects that were really here on site. So we always have to supplement what we know based on print sources. I look at lots of images from the 18th century that show how people lived. So that's often how we know what baskets look like. Things that would have been organic and not survived over 250 years to be in our museum collection today. So those are the types of objects that we always have to figure out what might have been in this space that would not have been listed in documents. So the way that we know who was really living on this site is that we look at probate inventories, which again listed all those possessions, but it also listed the people that would have been here on site. So that's how we know the Randolphs owned 27 individuals, because they actually appeared on the 1776 probate inventory of Peyton Randolph when he died. So that really helps us better understand what was the family life here, what was the structure, how many children were here. based on how they were listed on the inventory, we can better understand maybe who was cooking in the kitchen, who might have been doing the laundry in this space, what would the children have been helping with and doing on the property. So those are the types of records I use to better understand who was maybe living and working in these spaces on site.
Amanda mentioned a number of ways historians can use primary sources to fill in the gaps left in the historical record by those who may not have left behind a written account of their own, or gaps where certain artifacts didn't survive. However, even when artifacts do survive to the present and the people who use them are still well known to us, we still sometimes have gaps in the historical record to fill in. Let's look at another furnished space to see what other ways historians can use primary sources to answer questions we have about the past.
So the room that we're standing in right now, we're at the Peyton Randolph house, and we're standing in the oak bedchamber, which was on the second floor of the main house. And we think that this probably was the bedchamber that Elizabeth Harrison lived in, which was Betty Randolph's niece. So I always wish that we knew more about the people that we're representing. And with Elizabeth Harrison, we don't have a ton of documentary evidence, but we do have, again, that Peyton Randolph probate inventory from 1776. And that probate inventory did list furniture in this space. So we do know that there was a bedstead with very nice bed hangings in it. We know that there was this beautiful clothes press probably in the space where all of her dresses and her textiles would have been stored inside on shelves. And then we also have a dressing table and a looking glass that was listed and a chair. So these chairs would have been the spaces where she was visiting with friends, where she would have been getting ready for the day, and then also probably doing any kind of educational work that she was doing. So we do believe that she possibly might have taken music lessons. A lot of young women in town were doing that. We have a lot of evidence, especially at the Robert Carter house just down the street, where all of the children took music lessons from a music master that would have traveled and stayed with the family 2 days a week. And so we try to show instruments in the house that talk about that connection to women's education. So the types of records that we used to furnish this space, we used a lot of diary entries and a lot of letters. And those letters often tell us what women were doing every day in their lives here in Williamsburg. A lot of the time that they were spending was spent learning to draw, learning how to sew, do fine sewing and needlework, and also playing music and singing. So when we were coming up with a furnishing plan for the space, we really wanted to interject what her daily life might have been like. So we have letters in here. We have a wonderful little reproduction watercolor box that's based on an exact one in the collection that we have. So these types of objects help us better understand the types of activities she would have been doing on a daily basis, whether that was reading, sewing, working on her drawing and watercolors. And one of my favorite objects that we put in the room is this mid-18th century English guitar. And what I love about it is that these were very nice instruments that would have been imported from England. And young women like Elizabeth might have been given something like this to practice on. So a lot of what we know about women in Williamsburg is what documentary evidence does survive. So letters that survive, diaries that survive, and often those are, different men's diaries and men's letters. In this case, Elizabeth Harrison, we don't have her own life in her own words. We don't have her expressing herself through letters and diary entries. So because of that, we really had to think hard about what would women typically her age be doing, and sort of keep it general. Trying to find other young women around the same age and the types of educational opportunities that they were given, depending on their status and this was a very wealthy household, the types of opportunities that Elizabeth would have had, with her connections with the Randolph family. Furnishing these spaces, I feel, really does help us bring history alive. So we furnish them, we think really hard about which objects, which clothes press, which types of bed hangings, and all of those things come together to really make documents come alive, right? We want people to not just look at a list, probate or something, and see objects listed. We want you to see how they would have been arranged possibly, how they would have been naturally set out throughout the day. And really make history come to life. So when you walk into the Randolph house, I want you to think and feel like somebody just walked into the other room and they had just left this space. I want the spaces to feel like they were lived in, so that we can talk about these people and what did they do? What was their impact here in Williamsburg. And I just hope that these spaces, help us, with bringing history to life.
Welcome back. It's amazing how much we can learn about the past, and we're going to dig deeper into some more primary sources that we use here today. So send in your questions about women in the 18th century and the primary sources we use to learn about them, and we'll answer them live in just a moment. First, though, I want to ask both of you. As interpreters talking to guests almost every day, what primary sources do you use the most to bring history to life, and what do you start with when you're doing your research?
Well, I think since I'm portraying different individuals from history, I try to find out as much information about them as I can. Unfortunately for most freed and enslaved Black women in this time period, we don't have journals or diaries or letters, but we do have things like, say, baptismal records. The church that was within the city of Williamsburg, Bruton Parish, recorded baptisms for everyone. So you have white and Black people, free and enslaved people, indentured people. So that gives you an idea of maybe when they were born as women, when they had children, and about how old they were when they had children, or at least the year, or how old their children were. And then looking at, if you're an enslaved woman, who owned you, who was enslaving you. And usually they will leave records, maybe wills, who you are to go to when they pass away. Inventories also taken after a person's death. Did the person you're portraying maybe seek to self-liberate? Were there runaway ads for that person? And if you are owned by somebody who wrote a lot of letters, sometimes you find mentions of enslaved people in those letters, and is that the person you're portraying? And then you try to find out as much as you can about people like the person you're playing. So if you can't find out that information about, say, for instance, a woman I portray, Eve, from the Randolph house, who lived in the city of Williamsburg, was there another woman who lived in Williamsburg or in another city? Was there another woman who did similar work? And look at her life that way. So that starts it. I don't think you're ever really done, but that kind of starts the process. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I do a lot of work in the Capitol and the courthouse, so a lot of my sources tend to be legal text, whether it's the laws of Virginia, some of Henning's statutes, the country justice. But that's not my only research interest. So I guess one way to put it is it's all fun and games until someone breaks the law, because I like to look into the history of toys and games. And so one of the sources I found in that avenue was a book about, I think it was called Sports and Games of Skill, but it was all in French. I don't know French, so that was a challenge, but it was a lot of fun to work to piece together some information from it still.
Mm-hmm. You both bring up really good points, because reading things that people of the past would have read, whether it's a newspaper or a book or something, is a good way to kind of understand more of the thoughts and ideas they're working with in their time, but also using similar people as a good way when you bring to life people who we don't have as much documentation on. I think we use that same technique when it comes to furnishing buildings and things like that, using something similar. Please keep sending in your questions. We will be answering them live on air in just a bit. However, I do have one last question to continue this conversation. What are some of the challenges you've each encountered when trying to research women from the 18th century when using primary sources?
Well, I think probably one of the biggest challenges is that you're always looking at these women through other lenses, and I talked a little bit about, there's what's written and there's what's not there, so sometimes you don't even have that information. It's really fortunate when we actually find inventories or wills that list names, especially of enslaved individuals, but sometimes wills won't mention names, or inventories will just say, 18 people, 8 above 16 and 10 under 16. So we don't have names. And also a lot of these documents are created with certain bias. One of the, primary sources I mentioned that's really valuable to me is one that can also be some of the most biased. These runaway ads that we call them, of enslaved people seeking liberation, are written by enslavers who are seeking to capture them and have them return to their bondage. So some of the things that are written about the individuals are filled with bias. Even the fact that they're they're running away at all is filled with bias, where owners say, I can't believe or I can't understand why in the world they would have ever done this, knowing that most of the time people are running, if not for that liberation, oftentimes to see family members that they've been separated from one way or another. So just kind of that bias that you have to sift through to get to the information. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think part of the challenge, especially in legal stuff, of course, I didn't know French, so that was a challenge enough, but but in understanding the vocabulary of the time too, because often, we can read a sentence and understand it in our 21st century language, but would it have been understood the same way in the 18th century? So understanding how the language is used then, even if it is the same language, can also pose a challenge.
Those are both really good points. That we had talked earlier about context being a key thing in looking at documents, but then also reading in between the lines, keeping in mind that bias and looking at those different perspectives gives you a very different understanding of what you're reading. So we actually are starting to get some audience questions in. Amy wants to know, did most women know how to read and write?
Well, thank you for your question, Amy. And that's complicated, like a lot of the answers. We spend a lot of time talking about people in Williamsburg, so this isn't really how a lot of people lived. There were 2,000 people that lived in Williamsburg all the time, but there were 500,000 people in Virginia, during the Revolutionary War era. So in the city, most women, white or black, free or enslaved, probably did have that skill of reading and or writing, some type of math, some type of ciphering, being able to keep account books. But as you move away from the city, there might not necessarily be that need for women or men to know those skills.
And we have some questions coming in from Miss Hammond's class. They want to know, how was the iron used, the iron that we saw in the first video with Amanda when she was in the laundry? How was it used? And then also, did most women take care of their own clothes and the clothing for their household?
Ooh. These are some good ones.
Very good questions. Thank you, Miss Hammond's class. I have actually used those irons, and of the two types of 18th century irons, that one is probably kind of the most difficult to use, and still keep your clothes clean as a modern person. But what you would do is you would build a huge fire. So you all, I don't know if you could see the laundry clearly in the video, but it's going to be about as big as a kitchen fireplace. Huge fire, and you get that good bed of coals, because that's where your heat comes from. And with that iron, you place the iron directly in the coals, and you would have wool pads to help with the heat as you use it. And then when you would remove it, you would wipe it on, say, another wool pad, and you would iron clothes right on a table, usually with some type of wool or other padding on the base of it. You could starch it beforehand, and you would use it until it got cold. So you would usually have a few of those irons in the fire ready to go. I've also seen and used irons where they have I cannot remember what they're called, but pieces of iron that you put in the fire, but they're box irons, and then you put those pieces into the box iron, so you don't have the same heat, but you don't have to worry about getting ash or anything on clothes. So that was just the ironing part of laundry. Yes. So long, involved, very physical task. And what was the other question?
Did most women handle their clothing and the clothing of their household?
That depends. So, gosh, here in Virginia, in the capital city, of course, we've got a higher concentration of wealthier individuals. So we were in the Randolph laundry just a moment ago. Mrs. Randolph is not going to be doing her own laundry. She is going to have enslaved individuals to do that for her. But say somebody who is not nearly as wealthy as Mrs. Randolph, her husband's the Speaker of the House of Burgesses. That's a pretty high position. But I would say most other people are doing their own laundry. And it's going to take a lot of work. I mean, just as you described, all the ironing, that's one piece of the process. There's the washing and the mending, perhaps, the different fabrics. And feel free to chime in because I think in some of the inventories I've seen, often it's the folks that are doing the cooking and the laundry that have the highest value associated with them on inventories, because there's so much expertise in understanding what kinds of methods to use on different fabrics to get out all these fancy stains and different things. So it's a lot of work. So depending on your status in society, you may be doing just your laundry, you may be doing everybody else's laundry, or you may not be touching laundry at all.
And it is interesting to note that for most women, like all of the free Black women who were heads of households, and also a lot of free white women, this was how they made their living. So they're doing this not only for their family, but they could have dozens and dozens of customers on a weekly basis, where you're having to haul water. And if you aren't very wealthy, you don't have a well on your property. Also, you're having to go to public wells to do this. So yes, women, like 98% of the women, are very acquainted with this and doing it for themselves or doing it as a way to make a living.
It's funny, you mentioned clothing. You got to think about all the other fabrics they probably had in their households. And one thing I've learned as an adult is you definitely have to wash those blankets and those towels and those tablecloths and all those other things. Yes. But we all have another question from Mrs. Hammond's class. They want to know, what did women do for fun other than, for example, they've given sewing and drawing?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Ooh. I like toys and games. So one of the toys I've researched a lot lately is called a bilbo catcher, or it's very closely related to a cup and ball. So you've got a cup connected to a ball with usually a string, and you can pop it up and catch it. We see all sorts of either artist prints, other accounts where people of all sorts of statuses are playing with these simple toys. Now, while the design is fairly simple, depending on your level in society, the material can get very fancy. We have one in our collection that's ivory.
Wow.
Really fancy. But most of the time, they're just made out of wood. So any kinds of games like your bilbo catchers, your whirly-gigs, you could make one with a button and some string. But, we also have, more gentry women are, as they suggested, drawing, watercolors, music, and see, this is tending towards kind of the wealthier side of society, because they're the ones that have the free time and the availability for some of these fancier side pursuits. Yes. Pastimes, that's what I was
thinking. Definitely.
But even Mancala is a popular game we see coming up, and while we see in the slave trade, most individuals are being brought over without really the ability to bring much with them, but just because they don't bring physical possessions doesn't mean they don't bring a whole lot of wealth of traditions and knowledge and information. So Mancala is a traditional African game as well that is often seen, whether you could create a board just in the dust with some pebbles, or you could have a very elaborately carved and decorated one with very fancy smooth stones to play. So we see, everybody likes to play.
Everybody. Absolutely.
Well, thank you for sending in such great questions. Keep sending us more. We'll answer some more of them in a moment. But I wanted to remind everyone that primary sources aren't just written or painted things. They can be objects too. So let's meet with Neil Hurst, our Associate Curator of Costume and Textiles, to learn how objects can tell us about the past as well.
My name is Neil Hurst. I'm the Associate Curator of Costume and Textiles here at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Before us here, we have a cotton petticoat, printed cotton petticoat, and a printed cotton jacket. They match, and they belonged to a woman who lived in upstate New York in the Albany area named Anne Van Rensselaer. The jacket itself and the petticoat date to probably the late 1780s, perhaps when she was married in 1787. Having clothing is really an interesting story that we can kind of learn from Anne Van Rensselaer and sort of maybe even her, not only her shape as an adult woman, but also perhaps her even taste in clothing. So for example, the gown or the jacket is center front closing, which is what we would expect for the late 1780s, 1790s. It also has long sleeves, also very typical. But what's very interesting about this jacket and petticoat is the fact that the fabric itself probably dates 40 to maybe even 50 years earlier than Anne actually having it made up into this jacket. It may have been perhaps bed curtains or some other textile in the household, but that was then repurposed, cut apart, and remade into this jacket and petticoat. Now this is not unusual. This is very commonly done in the 18th century, but for somebody who is even of the wealthy sort, it's not considered unusual at all. The gown or the jacket, I keep correcting myself here because it is technically a jacket, is fairly typical for the late 1780s going into the 1790s. But what's always nice is to see some of the various evidence inside the garment, such as the center back of the jacket has little eyelets that are worked to put boning into it. The boning is now gone, and it was meant to be removed for washing and cleaning. Also, the pin sort of damage that goes down the front here, that we know that this garment was used repeatedly. Likewise, with the petticoat, we can see that it has its original ties to it, which is amazing, but we are missing one on this side, so it begs the question what happened to that one over the history of the garment. The gown that you see in front of us here is a really exciting example and one of my favorite pieces in the collection. The textile is just amazing. But it's a gown that came into the collection with a unique history, the fact that we don't believe it was ever finished. There's no signs of any wear down the center front of it. And it's also, as you can see in the image here, that it's missing its sleeves. It does appear that there was sleeves perhaps fitted onto it at some point, but they've been removed. But things like the trim down the center front, where we could see it's been basted to show where it's supposed to go, has been left unfinished. So a really unusual gown, sort of capturing a moment in time where the gown maker or the person who ordered it for some reason just stopped. And this is now in the collection, and it's a great piece for our tradesmen and tradeswomen who work here at Colonial Williamsburg to study, to understand a little bit more about construction. Unfortunately, we know very little about this gown, but it was acquired in New England. So the person who we purchased it from here at Colonial Williamsburg purchased it in New England. So a good chance that this gown was worn in the New England colonies and in the early United States, as this gown was probably made in the late 1780s, early 1790s. And one of the things you might find immediately striking about the fabric that you see here on this gown is the shine to it. It almost looks plasticky. This is in fact a glazed cotton, and so they've applied in this case we know, as we did scientific analysis on this in our analytical lab, a carbohydrate, probably a wheat-based starch or a wheat-based substance to the surface of this gown to give it that bright, shiny appearance. This is very commonly found on gowns in the 18th century, but what happens is over the years they get washed through various means, and we oftentimes lose that bright, shiny appearance that they once would have had. And so we're very lucky to have this example in the collection that shows us a pretty much untouched gown, unwashed, with its complete glaze intact on the surface of it. Clothing is really important. We can learn so much from an individual and so much from the makers who produced those clothings 200 years ago in the 18th century. Whether it's body shape, how tall somebody was, the different types of textiles they would have been using. There's a tremendous amount of information in these single garments that we've shown you here today. If you're interested in learning more, you can always visit our e-museum. The entire collection that we have digitized thus far is on there. And feel free to check that out 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's some wonderful objects on there for you to explore.
It's always exciting to have something that was worn by a person of the past, but clothing isn't the only thing that was used by historical people. Things like pottery can also tell us a lot about life in the past. Let's take a look at our featured primary source to examine how a piece of pottery can illuminate so much of the 18th century. So this piece of pottery you can see right now is a Colonial Era chamber pot. excavated from Weatherburn's Tavern, which is a site here in town. It's one of our original buildings. Immediately, our team of archaeologists tell us that when they see a piece of colonial ware, they have a better idea of who we can expect to find in that space in the 18th century. Colonial ware is a term for pottery produced in the colonies by individuals of African descent, and often both produced and used by women. So, Christy and Hope, what can we learn from this piece of pottery that was found here in town?
Well, I think it lets us know, as you said, that these women are there, and that's one of those things where you have, this primary source in addition to the inventory, with after Weatherburn passed. So we know even the names of some of those women who might have created this property, and it speaks to the skill that these women had. Sometimes people don't realize the amount of skills that women were working in, and that these were, even the skills that we think, well, women only did laundry and cook. Well, you learn a little bit about laundry. Cooking is just as arduous, that these were, physically taxing things that women did.
One thing I like to think about with any kind of artifact source, we think of artists sign a painting, but sometimes you'll have a maker's mark on something like this. Sometimes we can look at it and see how it was constructed, just like the one gown in the video there. So looking at, the technique, what's similar and different to what we've already found. Is there something unusual about this that might tell a different story or shed light on a specific person because it was found, say, at Weatherburn's or at another specific site? So one thing I do like to ask children or young people when I'm talking with them is, if I never met you, what would I learn about you from just going through your trash?
Very good point, because sometimes in written primary sources we don't get more of the specific everyday, mundane, detailed things, but everyday objects can definitely tell us a lot more. So we have some questions. Susie wants to know, what legal rights did women have if their husbands passed away?
Okay. So we can look at a couple of examples to unpack this a little bit. You're probably familiar with Martha Washington. But George Washington was not her first husband. So when Daniel Parke Custis, her first husband, does pass away, she is left with some property, and there are some restrictions that go along with that. But when she remarries George, it is now his job to take care of a lot of the legal affairs. The husband is seen as the public head of household, so if he has to go to the courthouse to settle any taxes or lease agreements or anything like that, it's his job to do that. So we've got a couple of French terms for this. Femme sole, a woman on her own. Femme couvert is a woman who is covered in marriage, usually by her husband, then who becomes the public head of household, and she is the private head of household. So she's seeing to the things that are running well within the home. Now she also has some rights, though, in that if, while taking care of those public affairs, if he decides he wants to sell some of her property, he can't do so without her permission. So much so that the county officials will meet with her separately, where he is not even in the room, to explain what's going on. If she says no at that point, the sale doesn't happen. So it's a little complicated, but women do certainly have some rights after their husbands pass away, and rights to some property in there as well.
And you talking about Martha Washington brings to mind another interesting case involving a woman by the name of Anne Ashby. And she was born enslaved and was one of the few individuals that was actually able to be purchased by her husband and then manumitted or freed. So that was two separate things, and that didn't really happen a lot. And so they lived, as free people together for a couple of years. And then Matthew Ashby dies. Now, at that time, Anne would inherit, everything after Matthew's debts are paid for and taken care of. She was also a laundress as well, that we can tell from their inventory. But within about 2 years' time, Anne marries another man by the name of George Jones. And within 6 months or so of that marriage, George Jones, after having taken over her property, actually puts an ad in the Virginia Gazette, the local newspaper, saying that he will not pay any of his wife's debts and asking merchants and shopkeepers not to extend her any credit in his name. So you see, the rights that she had, were usurped by the second husband and left her kind of destitute after that.
That's something for a lot of women to consider who have the legal right to marry, if they actually want to or not. What do they gain? What do they lose potentially? So Ryan and Betsy actually have some similar questions. They want to know more about household things like sewing and making clothing or baking bread. Do all women do that? How did they learn to do that? Or did they go outside the home for things like clothing and bread?
Wow, that's a good. those are good questions. Well, I know I can speak to a little bit about Elizabeth de Rosario, whose job was as a seamstress. So not necessarily the fine fitted garments that the mantua-maker would make, but that's something that she would have likely learned from her mother. I think I mentioned there were 4 free black heads of households in 1782 when a list was taken of residents. And all of those were actually women. Anne Ashby Jones was actually one of them. So these are things that girls are learning from mothers, aunts, maybe grandmothers, what have you. For kind of the more traditional trades, there could be apprenticeships where these young women are learning, free young women are learning until they reach their majority at 18, and they would become journey women. And for some of these skills and trades, enslaved women are learning the same thing. It's just that, since they are not free individuals, there's not the prospect of them going to open their own shop. So that usually from one woman to another woman is how you would learn these sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, and just like today, we can make some of our own things. Like we can put together a meal if we have the ingredients, but we also like to go to fast food places. We also like to skip that process sometimes. So in the 18th century, we've got right across from the courthouse is the town market. So you can go and get, if you wanted, you could get your bread there instead of making it. For example, like the weavers. Certainly you could weave your own fabric and then start making your own clothing and going all the way from scratch, but that's a lot of time. So while you may do that for some garments, most people, if they can afford to, are going to be buying from a number of different specialists, if you will. Did we cover everything there?
Those perfectly covered the question. I think that time and money, definitely big factors in the past and the present.
Exactly.
And speaking of time, we are actually running out of time. But before we wrap up, we know that there are a lot of myths about the 18th century, and we want each of you to briefly discuss a myth that you want to bust about women in the past or about primary sources. Hope, why don't you get us started?
Well, I think one of the big myths is that history happened a long time ago and we already know everything there is to know about history. There's nothing new involving history, and that is a huge myth. We are learning new things all the time. So there's actually a painting that I really love to use as a primary source. One that you don't necessarily always see is black people, in a moment of just respite from their work and their labor, enjoying themselves. Now, when I first started working here over 30 years ago, this painting was referred to as the Old Plantation, and there wasn't really a lot of information about who painted it. There was uncertainty about the location of this painting, and certainly about the people who were in the picture. There wasn't a lot known about them. But over time, one of our librarians, Mrs. Seamus, she was able to research and not only confirm that it was a man named John Rose who was from South Carolina. Not only did he paint this, but there's another primary source image of a woman by the name of Miss Breeny Jones, who he likely also enslaved as well. We also know exactly where this painting took place. That was in Beaufort County, South Carolina, where my uncle is from, so I have family down there. And we know the names of the individuals in that painting. So there's 12 people that are there, 18 names there, 18 of those names that you see listed are applied to those individuals. And this has all come within the last 30 years. And as we go on, you know, we might continue to learn more about them and many of the other primary sources that we use. Oftentimes, as I said, you know, it's one answer leads to a lot of questions. We're finding out a lot of things that answer questions but lead to more questions. So history is alive and we're learning all the time.
Perfectly said. And Christy, what myth do you want to bust today?
Well, often I'll hear a lot about how, you know, oh, well, women couldn't do that, or they didn't do that then, did they? Well, yeah, they did. So we have some evidence of women working in every single trade. Now, that doesn't mean it's an equal balance. Certainly there are some trades that are more common for men to have, some more common to women. But the only things that are limited in what women can do as, say, an occupation in the 18th century are what were called the three professions, being doctors, lawyers, or ministers. But keep in mind, doctors is a rather narrow definition in this time. So we certainly have plenty of female midwives and those that are practicing medicine in other ways that aren't technically considered doctors. So there's an awful lot of skill reflected in women and what they're doing in the 18th century.
We both gave perfect myths to bust. Thank you. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have today, but thank you both for joining us, and thank all of you for joining us today for our episode of CW Kids Ask and for sending us so many awesome questions. Try and find some primary sources to evaluate on your own the next time you're looking for the answer to a history question or questions, and consider what primary sources you yourself are leaving behind. We're grateful for the opportunity to share our passion for history with all of you, and we have to thank many people, including our donors, for the funding necessary to do so. This project was funded in part by a generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Thank you again, Christy and Hope, for joining us today, and thank all of you for watching. If you've been enjoying our programs, would you like to be a part of CW Kids Ask next school year? Send us your question and it could be answered in a brand new video. We're collecting questions about the colonial economy, daily life, the Williamsburg community, and the American Revolution. Email us at cwkidsask@cwf.org and watch for your question to be answered by Colonial Williamsburg. Thank you again for watching. Don't forget to watch our next episode on April 13th when we'll talk about how math, science, and other STEM topics were used in the 18th century trades. Until then, have a great day.